July 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. A German prisoner of war silently observes the contents of a transparent bottle. The liquid bubbles with a brownish, sweet effervescence, served chilled Coca-Cola. He had never seen anything like it, let alone proven. A veteran soldier of the Africa Corps, accustomed to rationing, coffee substitutes, and stale bread, he does not understand. The bottle cost 5 cents, the same price that American children paid with their allowances. That wasn't just a drink. It was a technical insult to scarcity, what the ideological textbooks of the Third Reich called American decadence was about to crumble in the face of a force that Nazi strategists never calculated, the logistical abundance of industrial democracy. It wasn't tanks, planes, or bombs that broke the faith of these men. There were soft drinks, chocolate bars, and strawberry sundaes. This is the story of how more than 400,000 German prisoners of war discovered in enemy territory, a world that Nazi propaganda swore did not exist, a world where even the vanquished ate better than free German civilians, a world where ice cream and Coca-Cola have become weapons of conversion, and where the war was won by taste. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story with surgical precision. Between 1943 and 1946, while German civilians survived on about 200 calories a day, German prisoners of war on American soil received 3,500. While sugar was rationed in Germany at less than 300 grams a month, and only when available, prison camps in the United States received 50-kilogram bags weekly, used in cakes, cookies, and sundaes, even served with cherries. A society capable of delivering ice cream to a defeated enemy in the middle of the summer of war was not just feeding men, it was dismantling a worldview. In this video, you'll discover how America used standardization, mass production, and abundance as silent weapons of conversion, and why many German soldiers, decades later, still defined the first Coca-Cola as the exact moment when they began to lose the war. If you value the story told with data, context, and respect for the facts, consider leaving the like and subscribing. This helps the channel to continue bringing stories that advertising tried to erase, and that reality insisted on showing. In Germany in 1941, America was portrayed as a giant with feet of clay, bulky but unstable. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, insisted on the image of a morally corrupt, racially degenerate, and technologically improvised country. Pamphlets distributed among the troops of the Africa Corps showed American soldiers relaxed, undisciplined, dependent on imported equipment, and led by a financial and political elite manipulated by foreign interests. German cinema reinforced this idea with grotesque comedies and decadent caricatures of the American lifestyle, presenting jazz as a symbol of disorder and Coca-Cola as cultural poison. On the front, this narrative was easily accepted. Two soldiers marching under the emblem of discipline, precision engineering, and Aryan order, the adversary seemed fragile, chaotic, and, above all, unable to sustain a protracted war. General Alfred Jodl, head of the German Operational High Command, declared in 1942 that America will be a poorly armed and uncoordinated colossus. Your time will be up before you learn to fight. This arrogance was not isolated. It was official doctrine. The instruction manuals for SS officers listed Americans as incapable of continuous effort, a civilian population addicted to consumption, an army hastily assembled. But none of these documents foresaw the real threat: the factory. While Berlin believed that military power was born of race, Detroit believed that it was born of production, and it was just beginning to spin. In 1941, the United States produced 3 million automobiles a year. In 1942, this same capacity was converted within months to the production of tanks, jeeps, planes, and ships. A Ford plant in Willow Run began manufacturing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. General Motors, which until then made Cadillacs, began to assemble anti-aircraft artillery pieces with clockwork rhythm. This change was not just technical, it was philosophical. Where the Germans relied on engineers and optimized artisanal processes, the Americans bet on standardization, scale, and rhythm. But perhaps the most ignored data by the Nazi command was the logistical capacity to supply not only armies, but prisoners. In 1943, canned food production in the US reached 5 billion units. Of these, tens of millions went to enemy prisoners of war. No Reich soldier was prepared for this kind of treatment. They expected punishment, they received pancakes, they expected hunger, they found butter, they expected silence, they heard radios playing jazz. In Germany, chocolate was a childhood memory. In the United States, it was even distributed in emergency rations. On average, a German prisoner of war consumed between 3,300 and 3,600 calories a day in the United States, far exceeding civilian consumption in his home country. In 1944, German civilians were getting 1,400 calories a day. Nazi propaganda had promised glory, but he delivered black bread and beet powder. The United States, accused of decadence, delivered fresh meat, milk, and dessert, even to the enemy. Pause for an irrefutable fact. In 1943, American milk production exceeded 119 billion liters, while Germany, suffocated by bombings and logistical collapses, could not supply even half of the basic needs of the civilian population. If this number surprised you, comment below. Shocking data. And it wasn't just quantity, it was variety, it was repetition, it was access. The sight of stocked shelves, running refrigerators, and menus with options represented a perceptual collapse for soldiers who had been trained to view the United States as a land of chaos and waste. For them, abundance was not synonymous with efficiency. It was a sign of weakness. But what they didn't know is that the real American power was precisely in this, producing so much that even prisoners ate like citizens. The gulf between what they had been taught and what they experienced in the prison camps was not just nourishing, it was moral. Industrial democracy was more than a structure of production. It was a practical doctrine that put even the enemy inside a supply chain that did not fail. And this constancy began to generate disorientation. Censored letters from prisoners addressed to families in Bavaria and Stuttgart reveal bewilderment. We have heat, we have soap, we even have dessert. The most recurrent word in these letters was not fear, it was confusion. Nazi propaganda failed not because it lied, but because he underestimated. It underestimated the American industrial machine. He underestimated the commitment to abundance as a sign of strength. And he underestimated the psychological impact of a system that worked, even for those on the wrong side of the war. The soldier who embarked in Naples expecting hell found soda with ice and scrambled eggs at dawn. But the complete collapse of belief was yet to come, because after crossing the ocean in refrigerated ships, these same prisoners would find in the camps of Tennessee, Texas, and Alabama something even more unbelievable: ice cream sundaes served by smiling soldiers in the summer of 1943, a scene that defied military reasoning. And that will be the center of the next part of this story. May 1943. The Afrika Korps capitulates in Tunisia after months of fighting in hostile terrain. Surrounded, worn out, and deprived of even the essentials, some 250,000 Axis soldiers, mostly Germans, Italians, and a few collaborators, laid down their arms before British and American forces. What they expected next was clear: humiliation, dusty fields, starvation, and punishment. Goebbels' doctrine left no room for doubt. Americans would treat prisoners brutally. But reality, in the first 24 hours, violently collided with this expectation. In sorting centers set up in North Africa, German soldiers received pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, milk, and sweetened coffee. It was not a propaganda gesture. It was the default menu for newly processed prisoners. According to U.S. Army logistical reports, each screening center was supposed to guarantee at least 3,000 calories a day for those captured, and that began immediately after surrender. It was the first shock. Next came the ships. The crossing of the Atlantic, which many feared would be done in cramped holds or improvised cargo, turned out to be the opposite. Liberty ships, mass-produced transport ships with a standardized structure, were used to transfer up to 30,000 prisoners to American soil monthly. The production was absurd. At its peak, a new Liberty ship left the shipyards every 42 hours. Each unit had compartments adapted for human transport, complete kitchens, ventilation systems, and what surprised the Germans the most, refrigeration. On board, the prisoners were fed ration equivalent to or greater than that of the crew, about 3,500 calories a day, with meat, fresh bread, vegetables, milk, and coffee with sugar. According to records from the USS General M.B. Stewart on July 4, 1943, ice cream was served to prisoners in the middle of the ocean, produced by machines on board that manufactured 10 gallons per batch. It wasn't just baffling, it was inexplicable. The logistics behind this crossing were calculated with mathematical precision. Each ship carried tons of food, organized in refrigerated, standardized, sealed and tracked containers from the ports of Norfolk and Newport News to the North African coast. And more than delivering groceries, the United States delivered a silent lesson. Even the enemy was included in its supply chain. No German war system had foreseen this. U-boats operated in the Atlantic, sabotaging Allied ships, but convoys continued to cross the ocean with regularity. The prisoners began to realize that they were embarked on something bigger than a war. They were inside a productive machine that ran without interruption. When they disembarked, the impact intensified. In Norfolk, Virginia, the world's largest naval port in operation at the time, prisoners disembarked in front of cranes, stacked containers, military trucks, and stocked stores. There, the contrast was visual. It was enough to look at the shelves. Hershey's, Nestlé, Mars, chocolate bars stocked like bread. On the docks, prisoners saw American longshoremen taking breaks with Coca-Cola bottles, vending machines, and imported cigarettes. What was rare in Germany, and restricted to the elite, was banal in the United States. A product that required logistics, sugar, glass, gas, and distribution was sold for 5 cents, even to the defeated. During the move to the interior, another shock. They expected cattle wagons like those used to transport civilians and troops in Europe. They found passenger cars, upholstered seats, windows, air circulation, and in many cases, dining cars. According to military records from July 1943, the menu for these wagons included fried chicken, vegetables, apple pie, and coffee served with milk. German prisoners accustomed to months of meager rations began to realize that the enemy had become, quietly, a purveyor of dignity. The collapse of perception was inevitable. How to reconcile the doctrine of German superiority with the practice of a system that gave dessert to its captives? This moral shock was reflected in the first interrogations conducted by American officers. Many prisoners remained silent, not out of fear, but out of confusion. A German logistics officer captured in July 1943 reported to the Red Cross, "We expected to starve. Instead, we were given a breakfast that not even our generals had tasted since 1940. These reactions were not isolated. Internal reports from the U.S. Army indicate that the morale of prisoners even recently captured oscillated between distrust and amazement. They had been trained to endure pain, but they did not know how to respond to systematic kindness. Arrival at the American camps would consolidate what the ships had started. There, what seemed impossible became routine. Coca-Cola machines, low-alcohol beer, free cigarettes, chocolate distributed in Red Cross packages. And an even more impactful detail, ice cream served regularly during the summer months. The same food that had completely disappeared from German civilian life since 1939 was offered, cold, in camps in Mississippi, Texas, Oklahoma. A war operation that included industrial freezers to fuel morale, even of the defeated. But what these prisoners didn't yet know was that American abundance didn't stop there. Because more than serving desserts, the camps offered wages, stocked canteens, and limited freedom to move around. The next impact would not come from the food itself, but from the possibility of buying it. For 80 cents a day, a prisoner could buy more Coca-Colas than a German family would see in a lifetime. And there began the real rupture, because freedom of choice, even in custody, was something that even the civilians of the Reich knew no more. The first thing that caught my attention in the American camps was not the barbed wire, the barracks, or the guards' uniforms. It was the sound of a bottle being opened, the psst of the Coca-Cola cap lifted by a metal opener, followed by the clinking of the icy glass. The scene was ordinary, repeated dozens of times a day in dozens of camps across the United States. In the light wood sheds in the Tennessee or Texas heat, newly captured German soldiers were faced with vending machines, stocked with cold sodas, candy bars, American cigarettes, chewing gum, candy, and snacks. A Coca-Cola cost 5 cents. The same value for anyone, including them, the defeated. The impact was immediate. There was no brutality. There was consumption. There was no humiliation. There was access. It wasn't an exception. It was standard. And it was this pattern that began to erode the foundation of an entire belief. The first Coca-Cola tasted by a German prisoner wasn't just a soft drink. It was a question. How could a nation that produced this on a continental scale be considered weak? How did a supposedly degenerate enemy distribute treats to those who had tried to destroy him? The ideology that formed them offered no answers. They had learned that the United States was a disorganized, racially contaminated, spiritually corrupted society. Yet here it was, functional, clean, stocked, and generous. A logistics system capable of guaranteeing the same flavor in every bottle, in every field, in any state of the Federation. From Alabama to Colorado, Coca-Cola tasted the same. This standardization, to the mind trained to think of German efficiency, was more humiliating than any punishment. It wasn't just flavor. It was method. It was control. It was industry. The same was true of chocolate. The standard Hershey bar, packaged in metal boxes, was delivered not only as a trade-in item, but as part of the basic diet. In addition to regular rations, the Red Cross packages, distributed monthly, included chocolate bars, instant coffee, corned beef, and soap. Each of these items required a specific production chain: sugar, milk, cocoa, packaging, refrigerated transport. For a country at war, keeping this system running was already a feat. Making it work to the point of including the captured enemy, it was something else. It was demonstration, a cold demonstration of productive power, a silent message. We have so much that we can offer even to those who have come to destroy us. But the biggest shock was yet to come. In the summer of 1943, the camps began serving ice cream, not as a treat, but as part of the eating routine. The cafeterias that had refrigeration used specialized machines to produce batches of artisanal ice cream in flavors such as chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, and pecan butter. A food that had completely disappeared from Germany since the beginning of the war was being served casually to prisoners of war in the middle of America. Records from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, show that on July 4th of that year, prisoners watched the production of live ice cream, handmade with ice, salt, cream, and sugar. Some were invited to help in the operation. They saw with their own eyes abundance being transformed into sensory experience. What was once just statistics now had smell, texture, and temperature. This daily abundance had a profound effect. It broke internal defenses. The doctrine of suffering for the Reich became ridiculous in front of a soft drink lit by a coin. The glorification of military scarcity, pride of the Afrika Korps fighters, was quietly dismantled by a scoop of ice cream. It was not about luxury. It was routine. The enemy was defeated not with humiliation but with standard. And this pattern was undeniable. It didn't matter the field. It didn't matter the state. The marks were the same. The prices are identical. The experience replicated. Mass production had become pedagogy. Military interrogations recorded this impact. An officer captured in 1943 declared in a tone of confession, "Germany trained us to resist pain, hunger, deprivation. But it didn't prepare us for cold Coke." This phrase, recorded in the archives of the International Red Cross, has become a symbol of dissonance. The collapse was not physical, it was ideological. They were not facing an army. They were facing a civilization that worked. And this civilization offered the enemy something that Germany itself could not offer its people: normality. In the following weeks, this initial astonishment would become routine, and this routine would become corrosive. Prisoners who had spent months surviving on minimal rations began to gain weight. Their bodies changed, but what changed the most was the mind. The concept of strength was no longer associated with discipline and steel, and it was measured in calories, sugar, temperature, and repetition. Abundance was no longer a detail. It became the invisible weapon, a weapon that did not destroy, transformed. But if Coca-Cola was the first symbol of this transformation, what followed would be even more powerful, a supply structure so efficient that even waste would become a cause for shock. Because in America, even excess was institutionalized. And that will be the next impact that these men would never forget. Nothing in the workings of American prison camps was improvised. The abundance perceived by German prisoners was not a facade. It was merely the visible surface of a monumental logistical structure. What they saw as excess was, in fact, the result of high-precision technical planning, supported by an industrial chain that operated at a war pace, but with a logic of peace. Coca-Cola, distributed in all fields, followed an absolute standard. Same taste, same price, same access. The concentrate came from Atlanta, was fractionated and bottled locally by dozens of licensed factories, which operated with weekly production targets. Internal company records show that in 1943, production reached 5 billion bottles, a number unthinkable for any European nation at war. Camp Hearn, Texas consumed approximately 7,000 bottles a week, and it received its shipments like any American base, by trucks, by trains, by schedule. The same was true of ice cream. In 1943, more than 500 million gallons were produced in the United States, much of it destined to supply the armed forces and their prisoners. Campgrounds with refrigeration received weekly shipments of 50 to 100 gallons during the warmer months. When possible, industrial ice cream makers were installed on site, and when that wasn't feasible, homemade versions were produced with ice blocks, salt, and hand beaters, supervised by cooks trained by the army itself. This effort was not symbolic, it was doctrine. Ice cream was treated as a strategic item for maintaining morale, and, ironically, the high morale reached the prisoners as well. In the train cars, the pattern was repeated. During travel between ports and camps, prisoners traveled in passenger cars with ventilation systems, and in many cases were provided with meals in dining cars. The menus, standardized and documented, included fried chicken, boiled potatoes, vegetables, buttered breads, and lattes. The same ingredients were found in the canteens of the camps, supplied with almost commercial efficiency. According to the records of the Army quartermaster, these canteens stocked brands such as Hershey, Mars, Nestlé, as well as regional soft drinks such as RC Cola, Dr. Pepper, and Orange Crush. A shelf in an Alabama camp had more variety of candy than an entire region of Germany in 1944. The system did not tolerate failures. When a shipment was delayed or a batch of sugar hardened, as happened in Aliceville, Alabama, officials did not seek to recover or adapt. They simply discarded and ordered replacement. Prisoners who witnessed this kind of waste reported incredulity. In later testimonies to the Red Cross and in memoirs published decades later, several former prisoners described such logistics as impossible and almost provocative. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them all along. It wasn't brutality, it was regularity. It wasn't propaganda, it was a process. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and want to see more stories that unite numbers and humanity, like and subscribe. This helps the channel to continue bringing this type of detailed content. But the real impact of this technical gear was not only in the delivery, it was on repeat. A system that served Coca-Cola for 5 cents, chocolate for 10, and ice cream with 3 flavors even to prisoners wasn't just efficient, it was unshakable. And for those who came from a nation where everything was scarce, where improvisation was routine, that sounded like logistical heresy. But the prisoners had not yet seen the worst, the day they discovered that even sugar was thrown away, and that abundance for Americans was not a privilege, it was an expectation. The first great crisis of the German prisoners was not one of discipline but of understanding. The codes they had learned to crack for years, scarcity as honor, sacrifice as strength, made no sense in American prison camps. They watched intently in silence a scene in the cafeteria in Aliceville, Alabama. Bags of sugar had hardened from the humidity. In any German city, this sugar would have been reused, boiled, dissolved, reused to the last gram. But there, in the United States, the cooks simply discarded it. There was no alarm, meeting of officers, or contingency plans, just another request for replacement. Sugar was treated as a replaceable input, not as a currency of survival. For soldiers who grew up hearing that suffering polishes the spirit, seeing an economy capable of wasting what in Germany was worth as gold was more than offensive, it was disorienting. In the line of self-service, prisoners watched American soldiers sweeten their coffee up to 2 or 3 times, pouring entire spoonfuls of sugar without hesitation, and worse, dropping mugs that are still full at the end of the meal. Within a few months, Germans witnessed desserts being served daily, fruitcakes, apple pies, shortbread, all accompanied by whipped cream and condensed milk. They were common recipes, made with an abundance of ingredients, often reusing the same batches of eggs and milk supplied by local producers in fixed contracts with the army. The country bakery functioned as an industry on a scale. It maintained daily operations throughout the war period, with detailed reports on the consumption of flour, yeast, sugar, and margarine. What started as astonishment, little by little, turned into discomfort. Prisoners reported in censored letters and post-war memoirs a sense of shame as they realized that they ate better in prison than they had eaten during the entire campaign in Africa. One soldier, formerly of Africa Corps, described his first chocolate pudding with whipped cream as an insult to the rules of war. Abundance, in that logic, was not just a privilege, it was a moral transgression. The guards who served trays with 2 or 3 dessert options seemed unaware of the psychological weight of that gesture. For the average American, treating a prisoner with dignity was a constitutional practice. For the German soldier, it was a total reversal of hierarchy. It made no sense that the victorious enemy would not demand humiliation in exchange for clemency. The historical irony deepened with the small acts. Bottles of Coca-Cola, sold for 5 cents in the canteens, were opened, half drunk, and left on the tables. There was no strict supervision over use. If the prisoner bought it, it was his, and if he wanted to take just 1 sip, it was within his right. In Germany, where even fresh water was rationed, that gesture was interpreted as obscene. At a camp in Tennessee, prisoners watched as a distribution truck rejected a load of chocolate bars because of dents in the packages. The batch was redirected for disposal. The reason? The candies would not meet the standard of visual presentation expected by the military system. It was later discovered that even in wartime, contracts with companies like Hershey specified minimum packaging integrity criteria to keep the consumer experience intact. It was no longer just what the prisoners ate, it was how they ate. The canteens had tables with clean towels, bowls with unlimited sugar, jars with jam, butter, and real coffee, not substitutes. Instead of controlled portions, most of the ingredients were offered in abundance. Meals were not designed to humiliate, they were designed to supply, and this silently violated everything that Nazi doctrine had taught them. Abundance does not create strength, Goebbels said. But here, in the daily practice of an American prison camp, abundance was the basis of order. Food was not rationed because there was fear, it was distributed because there was production. This perception caused an emotional inversion. Instead of arousing anger or a spirit of revenge, American abundance generated moral disorientation. How could a nation share so much with those who had tried to destroy it? A German officer, in an interview with the International Red Cross years later, confessed, "We expected to be treated as enemies. We received vanilla pudding. It broke something inside of us." For many, the simple fact of eating 3 times a day with dessert included was more impactful than any discourse of political re-education. The food was irrefutable evidence that the Nazis were wrong. And more than that, it was a silent show of strength. What the prisoners did not know yet is that this abundance was not local, it was national. It wasn't improvised for the fields, it was the direct reflection of a supply machine that operated at full efficiency, from the agricultural field to the battlefield, and that soon they would witness this machine working beyond the gates, because the next battlefields for these prisoners would no longer be surrounded by barbed wire, but by cherry trees, canning lines, and school milk trucks. Upon arriving at the railroad hubs of the United States, the German POWs expected what they knew: freight cars, hay on the floor, bars on the windows, the transport of animals they had experienced in Europe. But what they found was a revelation. American trains didn't use cattle cars to transport men, they used passenger cars. With upholstered benches, functional toilets, and clean windows, the journey of former Axis combatants felt more like a tourist displacement than the movement of prisoners. In many cases, the trains included dining cars, and there, between one camp and another, there was another fundamental shake-up in the ideological edifice brought from Germany. There was no separation between classes. Workers, civilians, soldiers, prisoners, all were served with the same efficiency, with the same cutlery, by the same officials. The meal of the worker who embarked in Chicago was identical to that of the New York executive, and if the American army was on the same train, there was no exclusive feast. Menus recorded in 1943 reveal full meals: fried chicken, vegetables, mashed potatoes, apple pie, and hot coffee. The cost? Cents. The standardization of experience, accessible to any citizen with change in his pocket, subverted the logic of privilege that defined the German social structure. Inside the cars, the atmosphere was quietly revealing. For German soldiers accustomed to the automatic deference of higher ranks, seeing a train driver sit next to an American officer for lunch, unceremoniously, without distance, challenged not only military hierarchy, but an entire status-based construction of personal value. The waitress who served the dishes called them all by the same pronoun. There was no title, salutation, or bow. There was service, and he was the same. One prisoner of the Africa Corps, who would later write his memoirs, described the moment as, "The first day I realized that hierarchy was not a commandment of nature. The American system was not disorganized, it was horizontal." And this horizontality revealed something even more shocking to the eyes trained by Nazi propaganda. It was not a question of weakness, it was about efficiency. Trains that crossed entire states respecting schedules, supplying stations with hot meals, maintaining minimum standards of comfort for any passenger, including prisoners, did not indicate a moral collapse. They indicated an invincible infrastructure. This pattern of equality was repeated throughout the entire civil structure. Upon arriving at the final camps, places like Camp Crossville, Tennessee, or Camp Hearn, Texas, the Germans expected conditions to tighten, but they found electric lighting, hot water, flushing latrines, and heated dormitories. The accommodations looked like simple schoolhouses, but with a detail impossible to ignore. The canteen, known as PX, Post Exchange, the camp's in-house store operated as a stocked market. It sold soft drinks, sweets, cigarettes, hygiene products, and when refrigeration allowed, even fresh fruit. The prices? The same ones that the Americans paid outside the walls. A Coca-Cola cost 5 cents, a chocolate bar 2, a packet of shortbread cookies, an item that did not exist in Germany, could be bought with the daily wage of 80 cents that the prisoner received for his work in the camp. The math was cruel. One prisoner earned enough a day to buy 16 items that, in Germany, were controlled by passwords, rationing, or simply disappeared from civilian distribution. This realization did more than shock. It eroded the sense of sacrifice. The structure of the camps followed principles established by the Geneva Convention. But what the Americans offered went beyond what was necessary. The food wasn't just enough. It was plentiful. 3 meals a day, with an average of 3,500 calories, accompanied by desserts, milk, and sweetened coffee. Meals were served on metal trays with partitions, and menus ranged from roast meat, eggs, rice, cooked vegetables, and often fruit pies or puddings. This standardization was not improvised. It was supported by military contracts with civilian suppliers, regional farms integrated into war logistics, and a 24-hour distribution chain. By comparison, Red Cross reports on German civilian food estimated an average of 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day for the population between 1943 and 1945. With limited access to meat, milk, and sugar, even active duty soldiers were often given lower rations than prisoners on US soil. The discrepancy didn't stop at calories, it was in the dignity of consumption. The Germans believed that strength came from order, and order from hierarchy. But in the American camp, order was maintained without shouting, without intimidation, without humiliation. The system worked because everyone obeyed the rule of standardization. The prisoners soon learned that, contrary to what their commanders claimed, it was not brutality that sustained the American empire. It was planning. The queues worked. The schedules were respected. The resources are abundant, and no one needed to prove their superiority. She was in the statistics. The 1944 military acquisition reports record purchases of more than 380 million pounds of chocolate for military use alone. The annual production of soft drinks has reached billions of bottles. Milk production exceeded 100 billion litres per year, allowing public schools to have daily distribution programs for children. Meanwhile, German cows were slaughtered for lack of feed, and Berlin cafes served chicory mixed with sawdust. The contrast was so absolute that it became impossible to rationalize. And it was in this abyss, not in the rifles, that ideology began to crumble. A German soldier years later confessed to a historian, "Propaganda told us that America was decadent, but on the train to the camp I saw a black worker and a white engineer eating the same lunch, in the same car." This was not decadence. It was something we had never achieved. On the rails crisscrossing the continent, prisoners learned that America's strength lay in its logistical democracy, an equality applied with mechanical precision and served in aluminum trays. And if the crossing by the trains was the structural shock, what came next would be the evidence that that abundance was not momentary, it was not theatrical, it was permanent, it was industrial. Because on hot summer days, prisoners discovered that in America, even ice cream was a matter of state. In the winter of 1943, the temperature in American prison camps dropped below freezing in many southern states. However, the barracks were heated, the beds upholstered, And in the cafeterias, the smell was not of scarcity, but of freshly baked cinnamon cake. The scene that was repeated that December was almost impossible to believe. German prisoners, many newly arrived from the African front, were receiving Christmas presents sent by American civilians. Hand-knitted socks, homemade cookies, packets of scented soaps, cards written by children in uncertain handwriting, and drawings of decorated trees. The shipments came from schools, churches, community associations, and religious groups. And they arrived with a clear message: even in war we are all human. For the Reich soldiers, raised on a doctrine where the enemy was subhuman, the idea of being treated with compassion by mothers and teachers in the country they were fighting against was not only absurd, it was devastating. Local communities, many of them with children fighting in Europe or the Pacific, sent the packages voluntarily. There were specific campaigns, such as Share Christmas, in which each child was encouraged to prepare a gift for a prisoner. The instructions were simple: be kind. Imagine that he was also a son. Donations were collected, organized by volunteers, and distributed by military chaplains. There was no ideological filter. The packages went to any prisoner, without exception. The first reaction of the Germans was distrust, but the repetition of the practice year after year eliminated any doubt. They were not being manipulated. They were being treated like human beings. And this broke the narrative of Nazi propaganda with a force that not even 1,000 pamphlets could reach. Their surprise was heightened when they discovered that the churches organized Christmas concerts inside the camps, with civil choirs singing in English and German, conducted by volunteer conductors. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, a Presbyterian community brought a 10-foot Christmas tree, decorated with handmade ornaments made by the town's children. Prisoners helped set it up, and many cried during the ceremony. In Germany, in the midst of hunger, cold, and silence imposed by the Gestapo, Christmas was just a symbol emptied of spirituality, controlled and instrumentalized by the regime. In the United States, that same symbol resurfaced with color, smell, and human warmth. The logistics behind these gestures were also revealing. For each package to reach its destination, it was necessary to involve military postal networks, sorting by names and fields, entry registration, sanitary inspection, and coordinated distribution. It was yet another example of how American power was not limited to tanks or planes, but extended to the ability to mobilize civilians in operations of massive empathy. In 1943, it is estimated that more than 80,000 Christmas parcels were delivered to Axis prisoners on American soil. Now a pause for the fact: in the same year, Germany was not even able to deliver enough coal to heat the homes of the soldiers' own families. American production of civilian goods continued unabated, which included, paradoxically, even gifts for the enemy. If this difference surprises you, comment below with the phrase "unbelievable" or "logistics wins." The impact of this planned compassion went beyond the stomach or warm clothes. He struck at the heart of the moral structure of the captured soldiers. A Luftwaffe sergeant wrote years later, "Doctrine told us that the enemy was an animal, but that Christmas he sent me a pair of lavender-scented socks." The war had hardened his senses, but an American child, from a town he would never hear of, had broken this armor with a piece of cloth and a letter with a reindeer design. The camp commanders were aware of this transformation. Discipline levels increased after Christmas. Tensions eased, and the behavior in volunteer work improved, as if somehow those gestures had reordered the understanding of who the other side of the war was. For the United States, the gesture was more than charity. It was an affirmation of values. Showing the captured enemy that even his defeat would be shrouded in humanity was a quiet but powerful form of moral propaganda. And it worked. Many prisoners, upon returning to Germany after the end of the war, reported to the Red Cross and historians that Christmas 1943 was the first time they began to suspect the purity of the cause they had championed. Because no hate speech survived the smell of walnut cake coming out of a box with red ribbon. But if Christmas was the most emotional point of the experience, the next shock would come in an even more sensory way: the American summer. Because for many prisoners, the moment when Nazi ideology finally dissolved completely, it was with a spoon dipped in strawberry ice cream. For many German prisoners, the first sip of Coca-Cola was more than a taste jolt. It was a paradigm shift. That simple brown bottle, labeled in white letters, cold and affordable for 5 cents, contained more than a secret formula. It was the liquid embodiment of a civilization that had been portrayed as decadent and chaotic, but which, in practice, turned out to be irresistibly functional. Coca-Cola was present in all fields, in automatic machines, in precisely stacked wooden boxes, in cups shared naturally. Every bottle was identical, every sip the same, every experience replicated with industrial rigor, as if the United States had decided to win not just by force of arms, but by force of predictability. To the captured German soldier, trained in a doctrine of rationing, sacrifice, and moralized scarcity, the idea of a soft drink available to the enemy was inconceivable. And yet, here it was, cold, sweet, carbonated, offered without rancor, without charge, without calculation. Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink, it was a system. Its supply followed the same logistical model that supplied the armies: decentralized production, rail transport, standardized storage, massive consumption. The distribution chain was so efficient that even the most remote camps, such as Camp Trinidad, Colorado, received weekly shipments. By 1944, the company operated 64 factories within the United States, with the capacity to bottle millions of units per day, a number that far exceeded the production of all non-alcoholic beverages in Germany combined. The U.S. Army considered Coca-Cola a morale item, not just a refreshment. And what began as a benefit to soldiers soon extended to prisoners, not out of benevolence but by default, the same pattern that made the trains run and the camps serve 3 meals a day. It was the American logic of systematized abundance. This standardization was in itself a silent manifesto. Where Germany saw discipline in scarcity, the United States showed order in plenty. The taste of Coca-Cola was always the same, anywhere in the country. A consistency that impressed the Germans, who were used to the variation in quality, the substitution of ingredients, and the instability of war products. It tasted the same, every day, everywhere, one prisoner wrote, and that told us something, that they had total control. The predictability of flavor became a symbol of a culture that dominated not by oppression, but by regularity. There was nothing imposing about that bottle, and yet it commanded respect. The soda experience exposed a brutal contrast. In Germany, soft drinks had become rare. Production of sugary drinks had been cut drastically by 1942. The Fanta brand, for example, was born from the absence of basic inputs and was produced with apple and whey scraps in an attempt to keep the image of a soft drink alive. But in the United States, even in the war, Coca-Cola didn't just survive, it thrived. Its image was protected by the government, its distribution maintained as part of the national effort, its presence expanded to the most unlikely corners, including the camps of captured enemies. It was a paradox difficult to absorb. What for the Germans was luxury, for the Americans was protocol. More than that, Coca-Cola has become a symbol of inclusion. There was no restriction. Guards, cooks, prisoners, civilians, they all drank the same formula, in the same way, in the same glass. One prisoner noted that he had never seen an American spill Coca-Cola to assert superiority. It was drunk in silence, shared naturally, shared among strangers. It was, like ice cream and chocolate, a democratic good, and, for this very reason, disconcerting. The idea that a society could offer the same soda to its soldier and its enemy, without distinction, violated the foundations of totalitarian logic. Where Nazism required constant differentiation, the American system promoted homogeneity of access, and it was this homogeneity, more than any weapon, that deconstructed the enemy's imagination. With each sip, the prisoners digested not only sugar, but evidence. Evidence of an unbreakable industry, of a functioning society, of a culture that responded to war with efficiency, not hatred. Coca-Cola, contrary to what its critics claimed, was not a symbol of alienation. It was a test of competence, that even the superfluous could be delivered on an industrial scale, with quality control, with the correct temperature, even in times of global rationing. It was an assertion that America, rather than succumbing to the chaos of war, had turned war into yet another productive process, and it did so with a bottle in hand. Decades later, in interviews, many former prisoners would repeat the same phrase, almost like a mantra. The first Coca-Cola was the moment I realized we had lost, because there was no humiliation, no aggression, no indoctrination. There was only a cold drink served to the defeated, and that, this powerful normalcy, was what shook them the most. But the final blow to Nazi ideology had not yet been struck, because if Coca-Cola destroyed the illusion of industrial superiority, what would come next would destroy the soul of German militarism, labor. And who would lead this destruction? They were the prisoners themselves. On the deck of the Liberty ship, somewhere in the North Atlantic, German prisoners lined up under silent surveillance. The crossing to the United States had begun days ago, and the men, coming from the scorching heat of North Africa, awaited, without understanding, a distribution that seemed trivial in the eyes of the Americans, but which for them would prove to be a breaking point. A soldier on the Afrika Korps, accustomed to surviving on rations of crumbs and barley powder, was the first to receive what the crew called treat time, a metallic bowl filled to the brim with vanilla ice cream. It was not a mistake, nor an exception. It was a system. In the middle of the ocean, aboard a military ship, the United States had installed ice cream machines operating by independent generators, with the capacity to serve not only sailors and soldiers, but also captured prisoners. This was not a propaganda gesture. It was part of the US Navy's logistical welfare protocol. For the Germans, it was an immediate sensory shock. The soft texture, the biting cold, the sweet and artificial flavor of industrialized vanilla touched not only the palate, but also the imagination of an entire generation fueled by empty promises of the Third Reich. The impact wasn't just in the taste, it was in the contradiction. Ice cream symbolized peace, childhood, summer, security. It was the dessert that was dreamed of in times of plenty, not the food that was expected when defeated in war. And yet, he was there, produced on board, served in generous portions, accompanied by a spoon, delivered without sarcasm. The gesture revealed a difference in logic. While the Germans were taught that war required suffering, the Americans operated under the belief that even the enemy, once surrendered, deserved dignity. The US Navy had commissioned ships with specific cold rooms, designed not to preserve ammunition, but to store condensed milk, cream, and refined sugar. In 1945, the refrigerated freighters of the Liberty fleet alone transported more than 135 million liters of milk and dairy products, much of it destined for the production of desserts. Meanwhile, Germany rationed powdered milk, and children were given less than 200 milliliters a week, diluted in hot water and often mixed with vegetable substitutes. The sight of ice cream served on the high seas was described by many prisoners as the most confusing moment of their military lives. What should be punishment has become indulgence. The chill of the dessert accentuated the irony. The empire that promised order and glory had condemned them to sand and scurvy. The nation that was supposed to represent the disorder offered them frozen cream in clean bowls under quiet surveillance. For soldiers who had crossed the Sahara in trucks without tarpaulins and slept in holes dug by hand, this ice cream tasted like provocation, but also relief. The collapse was not just ideological, it was emotional. Some refused dessert in the first distributions, wary of poison, mockery, or psychological trap, but the systematic repetition of the gesture, served naturally, without speeches, without cameras, destroyed any thesis of humiliation. Ice cream was not a weapon, it was routine. And this detail made him devastating. The record of the logistics behind this operation is equally revealing. The ice cream machines used on board, portable versions of Taylor Company models, could produce up to 20 liters per hour, powered by compact ammonia refrigeration systems designed to withstand the humidity and oscillation of the sea. Between 1943 and 1945, the Army bought more than 135,000 of these units, distributed in naval bases, field hospitals, and, yes, prisoner transport ships. The Navy has also developed ice cream rafts, floating barges with industrial ice cream production systems, capable of supplying dozens of vessels without interrupting logistical operations. The existence of these ferries was kept secret until the post-war period, for security reasons, but when prisoners witnessed this system at work, their letters recorded a new kind of surrender, not military, but symbolic. Because if a country was able to serve ice cream in the middle of the ocean to its enemies, what else was he capable of doing? The childish symbology of ice cream activated distant memories in the prisoners. For many, it was the first time they had tasted something frozen with a sweet taste since childhood. Germany in 1943 no longer had the energy to refrigerate civilian food. Ice cream had disappeared from the confectionaries. The last memory usually came from before the war. The psychological impact was so strong that some prisoners came to associate the United States not only with abundance, but with lost childhood. A Wehrmacht officer wrote in his diary, "The Reich promised me the future. America gave me back the past." This kind of reversal was not planned by Washington, but it was effective. Nazi propaganda, built on adult heroism, could not survive the confrontation with a dessert served with affection. Decades later, repatriated prisoners still remembered the taste of that ice cream on board as the moment when the war ceased to make sense, because it was impossible to maintain hatred or moral superiority in front of a spoonful of creamy vanilla served by a young American sailor who just said, "Enjoy." There was no sarcasm. There was no threat, just efficiency. The war had taught the Germans that victory would come from disciplined scarcity. But there, in the middle of the ocean, they discovered that real victory came from the ability to offer what the enemy had never dreamed of possessing, and yet to do so with a smile. And if the ice cream collapsed the last sensory resistance, what the prisoners would find on dry land would seal the collapse of the doctrine once and for all, because the next step in this journey would not be about food, but about work. And the American camps were about to teach that even labor on enemy soil could be organized with respect, dignity, and salary. At the Aliceville, Alabama, prison camp, warehouses were supplied weekly by military trucks from regional logistics centers. Among sacks of flour, coffee cans, and cartons of condensed milk, there was one item that caught the attention of all the newcomers: towers of refined sugar sacks, stacked to the ceiling, each weighing 50 kilograms. The content was not reserved for special occasions or sporadic parties. It was routine. Every week new loads arrived. Every week part of it was used for confectionery, and every week some of it was discarded, hardened by humidity or beaten by time. What for the Americans was a mere supply operation, for the prisoners was the materialization of a moral and structural abyss, the enemy that had promised them racial superiority and world domination. He sweetened coffee for prisoners with more sugar than their own families received per month. In Germany, sugar rationing was strict. In 1943, the monthly average per person was 280 grams, when there was availability. Children were given priority. Adults gave up the quota to keep some sweetness in younger mouths. Sugar was hidden, saved, reserved for symbolic dates. The state used scarcity as a discipline, but in the United States, even at war, sugar was plentiful. The refineries operated at maximum capacity, integrated into the railroad network, with direct contracts with the War Department. In 1944, it is estimated that more than 6 million tons of sugar were processed for domestic consumption alone, of which a significant fraction was directed to the armed forces, and a portion of that directly to the prison camps. In Aliceville, a prisoner recorded in his diary his shock at a scene he would never forget. They entered the warehouse, saw the cobblestone bags being thrown away like worthless stones, and soon after, a new shipment arrived, as if nothing had happened. Waste was not celebrated. It was indifferent. The American supply chain didn't stop to assess the cost of each sugar crystal. It just ran, relentless, disciplined, invisible. What for the Germans was a luxury item, for the Americans was a baseline, and this broke with any conception of balance between nations. Because where the Reich built greatness on deprivation, the United States held power over comfort, a comfort that extended to the captured enemy. In the cafeterias, sugar was present in everything. Shortbread cookies baked in the field itself, cakes with frosting, apple pies, breakfast cereals, coffee served with cream and spoonfuls of sugar without limitation. There were no meters controlling consumption. There were trays, spoons, and prisoners serving themselves alongside guards, as if dessert was part of the surrender agreement. And in a way, it was. The gesture was silent, but loaded with a message. We have so much that we can share with those who tried to destroy us. This language of excess dismantled Nazi rhetoric more deeply than any pamphlet, because German propaganda had promised a world divided between the strong and the weak, between the disciplined and the decadent. But on the prisoner's plate, there was vanilla pudding, and no one was trying to convert him, only to feed him. The impact of this abundance was felt in subtle ways. Prisoners who initially refused sweets, out of pride or distrust, began to wait anxiously for desserts. They began to help in the kitchens, to ask for recipes, to exchange ingredients with Italian and Hungarian prisoners. Sweet food became a bridge. A Luftwaffe sergeant reported that when he tasted a peanut biscuit served with cold milk, He felt a surge of anger and envy, not because of the sweetness itself, but because it finally understood that Germany had failed to provide even the basics. "Sweetening the enemy's day," he wrote, "is the cruelest show of power." The logistical structure that supported this sugar empire was colossal. The United States controlled refineries in New York, Louisiana, California, and the Caribbean islands. Tankers transported raw molasses for processing. Specific railway lines distributed supplies to military bases, camps, and factories. Each distribution unit operated with weekly schedules, standardized volumes, and inventory redundancy. The chance of running out of sugar was lower than that of running out of ammunition, because for the High Command, maintaining morale, even among prisoners, was part of the war effort. There was no improvisation, there was planning, and he said, with each spoonful, "Here, even comfort is strategy." The magnitude of the system is revealed in a little-known technical fact. In 1944, the United States produced more refined sugar than all of continental Europe combined. The difference was such that the surplus was used to supply even the Allied nations. While London handed out treats by rationing, the American fields handed out desserts by default. And if this statistic surprises you, comment below with a short sentence, "Shocking data," or "Logistics wins." The Aliceville camp became a symbol not of repression, but of symbolic reorganization. There, sugar was more than food. It was a silent doctrine, and with every kilogram dumped in the trash because it was stoned, the ideology of German sacrifice melted a little more. Because nothing demoralizes more a man who believed himself to be superior than to see the enemy squander what his homeland could not even produce. But if sugar silently dismantled pride, what would come next would touch on something even deeper, the idea of freedom. Because in American prison camps, the next revelation would come not from the palate, but from the pocketbook. They didn't just eat well, they would be paid for working. In a small prison camp in Kansas during the winter of 1944, a Wehrmacht soldier carefully folded a cardboard box with a Berlin-addressed label. Inside, he placed 2 Hershey's candy bars, a packet of cookies, scented soap, and a can of corned beef. Attached is a handwritten letter. "Mom, I hope this helps." That scene, multiplied in hundreds of camps scattered throughout the United States, represented an unprecedented historical reversal. The prisoner, once seen as a burden of war, had become a provider. The United States, regarded as the embodiment of Western decadence, became the source of help for entire families scattered across devastated Germany. Between 1944 and 1945, tens of thousands of packages were sent from American camps to Reich territory, carrying not propaganda, but food, affection, and dignity. Each packet crossed the ocean like a living contradiction, the defeated enemy, now feeding his own hungry nation. This new dynamic did not arise by chance. In the American camps, prisoners received symbolic wages for volunteer work. The amount was modest, between 80 cents and $1 a day, but accumulated, it allowed access to indoor canteens, shopping in local stores, and, above all, the sending of packages through the Red Cross and the Army. U.S. officials authorized the shipments as part of a humanitarian protocol. There was no ideological restriction. A prisoner who adhered to the rules and worked with discipline could help his family across the ocean, even if they lived under the Nazi regime. And that's exactly what happened. Red Cross records reveal that between 1944 and 1945, prisoners sent more than 120,000 packages containing non-perishable food, hygiene products, and even cold clothing. The psychological impact of this gesture was incalculable. For the mother who received a chocolate bar from an American camp, there was no way to keep intact the view that her son was suffering or that the United States was a faceless monster. For the captured soldier, the act of sending food became a gesture of silent reparation. He had failed as a combatant, but now he won as a provider. And for the Nazi regime, which had promised national greatness in exchange for personal sacrifice, that inverted flow exposed the moral bankruptcy of the ideological contract, because the state that swore to protect its people could not guarantee soap, and the enemy could. In Leipzig, a woman wrote in her diary, "I received a chocolate bar from my son, the first since 1939. It is written in English. I don't understand, but I cried when I saw it." The contents of the package were not just caloric, it was symbolic. He said without saying it that the world beyond Germany's borders worked, and that, at that moment, the captured son was in better condition than the family at home. This perception eroded pride, but it also ignited doubt. Who, after all, was right? The advertisement or the flavor of that chocolate? The volume of shipments reached such a point that U.S. military logistics created specific units for sorting and shipping international packages from prison camps. Each box was inspected, sealed, and shipped with standard documentation. Transportation costs were, in many cases, subsidized by the American government itself, which considered the gesture part of a silent psychological war, and at the same time, a demonstration of universal values. After all, what kind of civilization is capable of feeding your enemy and still helping you feed your loved ones? The answer to that question was not rhetorical. It translated into numbers. In 1945, it is estimated that the United States produced more than 1.5 million tons of canned food for military purposes. Of this total, about 2% was allocated to auxiliary programs, including prison camps and international aid. For comparison, this amount was greater than Germany's entire annual production of processed foods that same year. That is, while the Reich struggled to feed its own soldiers on the Eastern Front, America produced enough to feed armies, civilians, and even enemy soldiers in captivity. If this statistic impresses you, comment below, absolute power or shocking data. This abyss of productive capacity dismantled the thesis of Nazi propaganda that the United States was an artificial power, supported by bankers and decadent Jews, because no artificial power sustains millions of men at war and still manages to sweeten the Christmas of its enemies. American logistics, integrated, modular, fueled by federal contracts and industrial innovation, proved invincible not only on the battlefield, but in the economy of peace. What was seen in each package was the materialization of a system that did not collapse in the face of pressure, but thrived in it. The prisoners' accounts show that for many, the act of sending food was the moment of greatest emotional conflict. There was no way to maintain the narrative of German superiority when one used one's own salary, earned in enemy territory, to keep alive the family that the homeland could no longer support. The collapse was no longer abstract. It was in the hands, in the fingers that cradled the chocolate, in the eyes that wrote letters in trembling letters. The war that was once fought for honor now boiled down to getting condensed milk for an 8-year-old sister. And if this seemed like rock bottom for Nazi ideology, there was still more to come, because the prisoners were about to know not only abundance, not only compassion, but education. And when they began to receive books, attend classes, and even take exams in full custody, the certainty that the enemy was inferior turned into something even more dangerous: admiration. In the summer of 1944, prison camps in rural Arkansas became centers of agricultural labor. Under discreet surveillance, and with relative freedom of movement, groups of captured German soldiers picked cherries, washed shipping boxes, and assisted in packing lines for ice cream parlors in the region. They weren't being punished. They were being integrated. Each working day was voluntary, regulated by international conventions, and, above all, paid. But what was most impressive was not the salary. It was the system. The efficiency with which refrigerated trucks arrived at the exact times, with loading calculated by weight and degree of ripeness. The way minimally imperfect fruits were discarded to maintain a strict visual standard. The organization of the packages, the accurate accounting, the timed shift, and the absolute cleanliness. One prisoner wrote, "There was no improvisation, waste was calculated, and even garbage was organized." What Nazi propaganda called chaotic capitalism revealed itself, in the eyes of the enemy, as a functional and pedagogically implacable cog. This forced labor had nothing humiliating. It was education. The Americans called it utilization of available labor. But what happened was a real hands-on lesson on how to build and maintain an economy of abundance. The fields in the southern states supplied tomato processors, meat-packing plants, canneries, and ironically industries that produced food that would be consumed in the fields themselves. The circularity of the system impressed the Germans. They collected the ingredients that would return as desserts in the cafeteria trays, packaged, labeled, and standardized. They participated in a cycle that included them, even though they were foreigners and captured. American logistics made no distinction between allies and enemies when it came to productivity. Among the prisoners were engineers, workers, teachers. Many of them took notes, sketched the machines, compared the processes with what they knew in Germany, and the conclusion was almost unanimous. Americans were not disorganized, they were flexible. The ability to adapt agricultural machinery for new functions, to redesign shifts to make better use of daylight, to optimize the use of packaging, all of this revealed a culture of decentralized excellence. There was no central plan, as in the Reich. There was a pattern of action that everyone seemed to understand, even without explicit orders. It was as if the system operated out of habit, not imposition. And that, for someone who came from a culture of rigid hierarchy, was as disconcerting as the taste of the first Coca-Cola. In Oklahoma, prisoners assigned to food packing plants reported shock when they saw boxes with small cracks automatically discarded by trained workers. The production did not accept 95% perfection. It demanded 100%. A Luftwaffe lieutenant described the process as almost military but without shouting. It was a revealing phrase. American discipline was silent, automated, naturalized, and perhaps for this very reason, more effective. Where the German soldier expected brutality, he found method. Where he imagined punishment, he saw a demand for quality. And where he thought there was weakness, he perceived a strength that came precisely from voluntary standardization. It is estimated that about 100,000 prisoners worked at some point in agricultural or industrial roles in the US between 1943 and 1945. This represented not only a reprieve from the domestic labor deficit caused by military mobilization, but also an opportunity for prolonged exposure to the American logic of production. And this contact was deep. It was not limited to the repetition of menial tasks. The prisoners observed stockpiles, control systems, labels, manuals. They learned, with their eyes and with their hands, that the secret of abundance was not mystical. It was organizational. It was possible to be efficient and human at the same time. It was possible to maintain quality on a large scale. It was possible to give dessert every day without compromising the machine. And there was more. In many of these camps, in addition to work, prisoners were able to participate in courses, workshops, and educational activities. Some learned English, others mathematics, accounting, mechanics. In some cases, soldiers who had been trained only for combat left the field with sufficient technical training to restart their lives after the war. One prisoner wrote, "Working for the enemy taught me more about production than all the Reich speeches. It was the pedagogy of everyday life, of invisible organization." Nazi indoctrination had failed to foresee the quiet power of American efficiency. What was most impressive, however, was the absence of spectacle. America did not show its systems as a showcase, he only operated on them. And that, paradoxically, made it all the more powerful, because it wasn't made to impress, it was made to work, and it worked. If a plantation needed 40 men for 4 days, there were trucks to take them, cafeterias to feed them, sheds to protect them from the sun, and systems to compensate them, all without breaking the routine. Normalcy was America's secret weapon. They did not make speeches about superiority. They only showed with canned peaches and packaged cookies how to build a viable civilization. And if that still didn't seem enough to destroy the arrogance that remained, there was something more. Because at the end of many of these work shifts, prisoners were not escorted back to barracks with guns drawn. They were taken to libraries. They received books. And there, in the pages of authors they had never read, they discovered the last missing piece, free thought, and that's what we'll see in the next part. In a simple wooden cafeteria in the Texas countryside, a group of German prisoners sat quietly. They wore uniforms marked with the letters PW, prisoner of war, but in that environment they were not treated with hostility. In front of them, trays identical to those of any other customer. A cheeseburger wrapped in wax paper, crispy fries, and a vanilla sundae with chocolate sauce. At the next table, a railroad worker smeared with grease was eating lunch in silence. In the background, 2 young men in suits laughed, munching on the same hamburgers. There was no distinction. The price was the same. The food was the same. The waitress served everyone with the same restrained smile. There, in that caloric banality, a social structure was revealed that the Germans had not considered possible. Democracy, not as an ideal, but as a visible, palpable, and edible system. A 25-cent sundae said more about equality than any pamphlet. This reality caused dissonance. For men who were brought up in a caste culture, where officers ate better than soldiers, where blood defined value, and where food was a reflection of hierarchy, the idea that anyone could afford the same dish was destabilizing. What was served was not just food, it was philosophy. In the United States, consumption was the great social leveler. It didn't matter if the man in the next row was Catholic, Protestant, black, Jewish, or foreigner. If I had money for the hamburger, it was welcome. And if he were polite and patient, he would be treated well. This model, invisible in the trenches of Nazi propaganda, appeared before the prisoners as a functional and irrefutable system. This perception was aggravated by repetition. It was not an isolated event. It was not a public relations effort. It was routine. Every city with a prison camp had cafeterias, markets, movie theaters, warehouses, and they all operated under the same principle. Access was defined by currency, not origin. Prisoners could buy candy, newspapers, magazines, including German newspapers printed in the US. Freedom of access contrasted with the German rigidity, where even the use of words was watched, and when a prisoner read an article critical of President Roosevelt in an American newspaper, without censorship, without omissions, he understood what it really meant to live in a free society. Food reinforced this because it was constant, democratic, and delicious, and because it subverted a moral expectation. For Nazi ideology, superiority justified privilege. In the United States, on the other hand, abundance justified equality. Because there was so much, everyone could have. And if everyone could have it, why exclude? A brutally simple reasoning, but one that collapsed the entire edifice of racial doctrine. The prison camps became an involuntary laboratory of applied philosophy. With each spoonful of ice cream, the captive soldier absorbed not only sugar and fat, but a moral shock. In Aliceville, Alabama, prisoners were allowed to attend a small indoor dining hall run by civilians. The system was self-service. Trays, fixed menu, prices posted on the wall. What most impressed the captured German officers was the fact that the mayor of the city ate alongside the street sweepers. No one had a reserved seat. No one received special portions. One prisoner wrote in his letter, "The waitress didn't know who was who. He served the same white bread to the man dirty with coal and to the owner of the bank." It was more than a culinary observation. It was a shake-up of values. The French philosopher Georges Bataille would say that the sacred is born from excess, and in the American camps, excess was everywhere. But it did not translate into ostentation. It manifested itself in sharing. Dessert, soda, cigarettes, fries, all were distributed naturally. This did not cancel out the internal racial and social tensions of the US, which obviously existed. But for German eyes, shaped by a doctrine of absolute distinction between the noble and the useless, that minimal coexistence was already revolutionary. And perhaps that's why so many of the former prisoners who survived reported that their conversion to democratic thinking didn't come through books or speeches. It came through snacks, for being able to choose the flavor of the ice cream, for being treated with respect even though he is an enemy, by seeing that even the policeman ate the same meal as him. It was a collapse by empathy, induced by food, and this was not in Hitler's plans. In 1945, an informal survey conducted by social workers at the Camp Butner camp in North Carolina revealed that more than half of the prisoners there wished to remain in the US after the war ended. When asked why, few talked about politics. Most mentioned freedom, food, respect. It was a democracy that didn't need to explain itself. It just offered itself, and he offered it with ketchup. The logistics behind it were also revealing. To ensure the same hamburger in every state, the American food industry operated with production, freezing, transportation, and storage standards that anticipated the era of globalization. The meat came from certified slaughterhouses. The bread was baked in industrial batches. The soda was bottled with schedules adjusted to the local climate. It was a system that prioritized constancy, and constancy in the post-war period was a symbol of trust. The Germans learned, without realizing it, that reliability was more revolutionary than speed, and so the doctrine of racial superiority began to rot in the face of the simplicity of a platter. What the Reich promised with fiery speeches, the Americans delivered with ice cream and fries. What the Führer demanded with hatred, democracy offered with mustard, and what seemed like a weakness, universal access, turned out to be, in practice, the most difficult force to destroy. But what happened when this sensory experience met with new ideas? When the prisoner not only ate, but read? When did you discover that you could think otherwise without punishment? The next part reveals the moment when food lost to the library, and the palate made room for consciousness. In 1943, while Berlin rationed calories and distributed black buns with sawdust to keep morale in ruins, The United States produced 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola. It was more than a number, it was a sentence. The Nazi doctrine, which swore to the purity, order and self-sufficiency of the Reich, never succeeded in delivering to its soldiers a minimum standard of comfort, much less pleasure. The Americans, far from the fighting, were able to fill their ships with 380 million pounds of chocolate a year just to supply their troops, and, as we have seen, even their prisoners. It was not extravagance, it was ability. It was logistical control on a continental scale. It was a machine that produced 500 million gallons of ice cream in the midst of the war, while Germany could barely supply a hospital with saline. In the mathematics of war, rhetoric froze to death. Goebbels' propaganda screamed on the radio about American decadence, about a weak and effeminate people dominated by financial interests, but no discourse could resist a cold number. In 1944, the United States processed 119 billion liters of milk. It wasn't just quantity, it was distribution. The milk arrived at schools, hospitals, barracks, trains, prison camps. It was transformed into cheese, butter, condensed milk, ice cream powder. The production chain didn't just supply, it planned, packaged, delivered. The system was so fine-tuned that the taste of a sundae in Boston was identical to that of one served in the Arizona desert. This standardization, seen as the mechanization of taste by European critics, was in fact the most efficient tool for cultural cohesion. And when applied to the captured enemy, it became a protocolized humiliation. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, and they ignored it. Germany bet on heavy tanks, on intransigent doctrines, on mechanized armies guided by ideological faith. America bet on ice machines, candy factories, refrigerated railroad lines. And he won. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts in depth and rigor, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you content like this, where the story is told not by slogans, but by statistics. The numbers don't lie, they just expose. And what was exposed in the American fields was the anatomy of a strategic failure. While German officers discussed how much fat a soldier needed to operate in the Russian winter, the Americans developed ready-to-eat meal systems that heated up in seconds, fed troops on the move, and still left room for dessert. In 1945, each American soldier consumed on average 3 times as many calories as a Wehrmacht soldier. And that was not a privilege, it was a project. Every calorie was planned, every bottle counted, every package weighed. Abundance was engineering. And engineering was what Germany claimed to master, but failed to sustain. It is at this point that the prisoners begin to abandon not only their belief in the regime, but their faith in the technical superiority of their own people. A Luftwaffe officer would confess years later that it was not the battlefield that made me understand our defeat. It was to see that each can of beans of theirs had a date, instruction and pattern, and we at the front opened rusty cans with bayonets. It was the beginning of a surrender that was not military, but philosophical. The myth of the efficient German dissolved before the methodical American, and with every chart, every issue printed on Washington letterhead, the Nazi narrative bled without fanfare. If the war was a competition of systems, data had already won, and the victory was silent, measured in tons. Tons of sugar, milk, coffee, eggs, preserves. Tons that traveled by rails, crossed oceans, supplied deserts. And if they even reached prisoners, it was not out of kindness. It was out of excess. Germany could barely feed its civilians. The United States was able to feed its enemies, and this was not only demoralizing. That taught him, because numbers, when repeated, create patterns, and standards breed trust, and confidence destroys fear. That's why prisoners began to wonder, if they do this to us, what don't they do to their own citizens? If they treat the enemy with sugar, how do they treat their allies? It was an inescapable logic, and it would only get worse with the latest revelation, the one that would lead even the most fervent Nazis to introspection. The moment when freedom came not on a platter, but through books. And that's what we're going to see next. In 1946, ships began to cross the Atlantic in reverse. But now they brought no troops, no supplies. They took prisoners back to their homeland. Those men, captured years earlier in Africa, Italy or France, landed in a Germany they did not recognize. What was once pride of race was now rubble. The stations were destroyed, the cities pulverized, the tracks crooked, the warehouses empty. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 and had left not even bread for the survivors. In Hamburg, a former prisoner described the landing as the opposite of arriving in the United States. There, everything was new concrete, stacked boxes, trucks with a schedule. Here, what was left was hunger, burnt cans, and long silences, bereaved families, aging mothers, children with empty eyes. And he, a former soldier, came back with more weight in his arms than he had carried on his back when he left. Packets of flour, chocolate, soap, preserves and sugar. Gifts bought with the prisoner's salary. Gifts for the vanquished. The image repeated itself everywhere. Thousands of soldiers were coming back stronger than they had left. The muscles were more defined, the skin more flushed, the stomach more trained. They had lived under surveillance but also under plenty. They had been enemies but treated with dignity. And the most shocking, most did not bring anger. It brought perplexity. For when they compared what they had seen in America with what was left in Germany, the inevitable and unbearable question arose: why did we fight them? One prisoner reported that his sister, upon receiving a scented soap brought from the United States, cried, not out of emotion, out of shame. It was the first time he had smelled lavender in 3 years, and that wasn't sent by an ally. It had been a gift from a former enemy. The cards have also changed. He no longer missed the Führer. There were reports about how American libraries worked, about how food was sorted by date, about how the camps had theater, newspapers, debates. Many of the prisoners had learned English. Others began to publicly question the dogmas of Nazism. In cities such as Würzburg and Dresden, the former captives became the first to criticize the regime and the first to advocate for the moral reconstruction of Germany, not because they were indoctrinated, but because they lived with the other side, and the other side didn't scream, served. The impact was so profound that in 1947, the CIA produced an internal report warning that many former prisoners were culturally closer to democratic values than some of the local population. It was an uncomfortable observation, but revealing. The war had failed not only on the battlefield, she had failed in the field of comparison. And now, the prisoners returned as living witnesses of the contrast. Witnesses to a system that, even in war, treated the enemy more humanely than the Reich treated its own children. And there was an even more disturbing detail. The former prisoners had not only eaten better, they had read more. In the American camps, hundreds of thousands of books were made available. German classics, yes, but also works of science, history, philosophy, and politics. Access was unrestricted. The soldier who had left as a blind follower of orders returned as a reader. And this reader now knew that there were alternatives, that there were other ways of living, of organizing, of dreaming. The Nazi Empire had promised greatness and delivered ruin. American democracy had promised freedom and delivered ice cream. This inversion could not be undone. Those who came back different. Many never adjusted to the new Germany easily. Others became teachers, translators, trade unionists. There were even cases of former prisoners who, years later, migrated back to the United States. The soil where they had been captives came to represent, for them, a possible model of life. And, as paradoxical as it may seem, this model was presented not with speeches, but with menus, not with gunshots, but with respect. When they returned, they brought more than groceries. They brought comparisons, and no advertisement was able to annul what the stomach and eyes had already registered. A civilization recognizes itself not only by its victories, but by how it treats its defeated. And at the end of the war, the most powerful country on the planet chose to share dessert with those who attacked it. This choice has not been forgotten. It was retold for decades in every family reunion, in every story from grandfather to grandson, in every look of someone who saw the collapse of an idea not by force, but by contrast. But there was still another type of prisoner, another group, captured later, from a very different battlefield, and which carried not only weapons but political consciousness. In the next part, we will look at the ultimate impact of the American experience on the most ideologized soldiers of the Reich, the SS officers. What happens when fanaticism meets civilization? In 1950, in the city of Frankfurt, a small group of ex-combatants founded what they would call the Verbraucherhalle, Consumer Salon. It was in practice one of the first standardized supermarkets in West Germany. Symmetrical shelves, organized aisles, products labeled by date and origin. It was not a government project. It was a vivid memory of an American prison camp. These men had served the enemy, picked fruit, packed soap, washed bottles, and without knowing it learned a model of civilization. What in the countryside seemed like a simple gesture of logistics now became a silent revolution. Every bottle lined, every box labeled, every standardized service, all of this was inherited not from a doctrine but from a sensory experience. They hadn't read about capitalism. They had tasted chocolate with condensed milk on aluminum trays. The transformation was generational. Men who had marched under the Gamma Cross now told their children stories about soda machines, about trains with dining cars, about bakeries that discarded bread because it was a few minutes out of standard. The contrast with post-war Germany was brutal. At home there was no butter. In the fields, margarine with honey was served. At home, sugar was measured sparingly. In the US, sugar was a symbol of organization and power. Abundance was not ostentation, it was method, and the method had seeped into his memories. The children grew up hearing more about scrambled eggs served in Tennessee than about the campaigns in Africa. Thus it was that, without books, without manuals, and without explicit doctrines, the American model infiltrated the fabric of German Reconstruction, not for propaganda, but for remembrance. The former prisoner who had seen a warehouse in Nebraska run with surgical precision now demanded the same from his small business. The man who had been allowed to organize stockpiles in Kansas knew that the secret was in distribution. And the soldier who had been treated with respect in the midst of defeat now led without humiliation. Democracy, previously imagined as a weakness, had become functionality. Power, which was previously seen as violence, was now identified as competence. Coca-Cola returned to Germany with them. The American company, realizing the symbolic potential of the drink, took advantage of the post-war economic opening and installed factories in the main cities of the West. In a few years, the soft drink that had scared away prisoners in camps became an item of national consumption. It wasn't just flavor, it was packaged memory. Drinking Coca-Cola was, for many, a reminder of a time when everything was more stable, fairer, clearer, and the same was true for ice cream, preserves, cereals. Each American product sold in Germany was accompanied by a story told at the table. In the countryside, we received this every Sunday. On the ship, we got a box with 3 of these. This emotional memory, glued to the palate, became culture. What begins as an experience becomes a narrative, and the narrative, when shared by thousands of former prisoners, becomes a social norm. In a short time, the values that had been fought at the front, standardized consumption, democratic access, respect for diversity of origins, became part of the practical vocabulary of Reconstruction, and, ironically, they were taught not by educators, but by men who spent the war as prisoners, prisoners who, instead of leaving broken, came back rebuilt. Not all of them. Many still carried guilt, resentment, trauma, but even these could not erase the shock of the comparison. Even the most skeptical remembered accurately the taste of the first ice cream, the sound of the refrigerator turning on, the texture of the bread served with jam. More importantly, they reminded us that the American system worked not just because it was rich, but because it was made to work. There was no improvisation, there was no privilege. Standardization was universal, and in the context of the war, it was also pedagogical. The prisoner learned more from the workings of the canteen than from any economics textbook. Some of these men became teachers, others bakery owners, engineers, mayors. In their functions, they reproduced what they had seen: the organized line, the attendant's automatic smile, the schedule posted on the wall. A prison camp has been transformed, paradoxically, into a management school. What began as captivity became observation, and observation became a method. Decades later, scholars of German Reconstruction would recognize this phenomenon as a silent effect of structural re-education. It was not necessary to rewrite the spirit of the people. All it took was to present a more efficient system and allow it to be seen up close. Democracy did not come by word. He arrived for the service, for the hot coffee served without distinction, by the bag of sugar that didn't need to be measured, for the library open to the captured, out of respect for the queue, for the standardization of the bottle, by the soda machine that did not distinguish origins. And when all this was taken back to Germany, it did not come back as a copy, it came back as a personal experience. America did not export ideology, exported system, and the system entered through taste, touch, the sound of the rails, the freshness of ice cream in the middle of the Atlantic. But there was still a final piece, the most symbolic, the most unexpected. Because among so many products, there was an object that no one expected to find in a prison camp, a book. A book that did not teach hate, but how to think. A book that tore down flags without shedding blood. And this book was opened by hands that until recently wielded rifles with the swastika. In the next part, we will see how reading, within a camp of captives, completed the collapse of the doctrine, and how the enemy, being treated as a human, began to think like a citizen. At the end of the war, when the numbers were put side by side, bombs dropped, soldiers killed, cities destroyed, one piece of data was left out of the official reports. Invisible, but decisive. The gun that didn't explode, that did not tear skies or destroy cities. It was served in aluminum trays, with 2 scoops of ice cream and chocolate sauce. It was opened with a metallic crack, coming from a machine refrigerated with 5-cent coins. It was read on the yellowed pages of makeshift libraries, in books that spoke of freedom, justice, and choices. This weapon, unlike the others, did not require submission. It only required observation. It was democracy, not as a theory, but as a routine. And when applied with logistical precision, it didn't convince, it disarmed. Prisoners of war, trained to kill, found themselves surrounded by a system that did not punish them, torture them, or subjugate them. He only treated them as humans. And more than that, as consumers, to be treated with respect. Eat the same thing that keeps it. Have access to the same soda as the general. Read the same newspaper as the common citizen. All this corroded, day after day, the foundation of the totalitarian doctrine that said that strength was hierarchy, that command was domination, that comfort was a sign of decadence. American prison camps functioned as discreet re-education powerhouses. No slogans, no speeches, no cameras. Just with consistency, and what seemed absurd, serving ice cream to an enemy, was actually the sharpest manifestation of an ideology that bet on the individual, even if he had made a mistake. It's easy to overlook this when you only see war through maps and battles, but on the field, where time was slow and routine constant, every detail gained weight. The bread served without haste, the book borrowed without censorship, access to music, cinema, debate. All of this conveyed a message deeper than any interrogation, and when they finally returned to Germany, it wasn't just their stomachs that brought back memories, it was the spirit. Many of these men, once indoctrinated to believe in racial superiority, came to admire a system where value was in functioning, not origin, and they began to question, if the enemy who served Coca-Cola to the captured was weak, why did he win? The answer was before everyone, and it was brutal. He won because he didn't need to destroy to dominate, because he built a system where even the enemy felt he belonged, where even error was treated with dignity, where strength did not come from fear, but from trust. The irony, bitter to some, is that the American obsession with comfort, ridiculed by Nazi propaganda, was precisely the element that broke the ideological armor of the prisoners. They expected punishment, they found respect. They expected scarcity, they received abundance. They expected hatred, and received functional silence. This was the invisible weapon of democracy, not a missile, not a tank, but the sum of small, standardized and consistent decisions. The decision not to punish with hunger, the decision to deliver books, the decision to build refrigerated trains, the decision to treat the consumer, whatever his history, as a citizen. In a world where everything was rationed, where even ideas were censored, American democracy produced the unthinkable, freedom distributed in the form of soda, ice cream as a public policy, fresh bread as cultural resistance, chocolate as a lesson in humanity. Nazi propaganda said that America was weak because it treated its soldiers well, because it allowed criticism, because it offered variety, because it gave choice. But in the prison camps, these supposed weaknesses proved to be weapons of conversion. What for the Reich was disorder, for the prisoners became stability. What was denounced as decadence turned out to be organization. What was painted as weakness proved to be moral strength. Is it possible to win a war with ice cream, with Coca-Cola, with books and movies? The history of these prisoners suggests so. That, contrary to what the generals expected, the war does not end only with treaties and trenches. It remains in the memory of those who return. And if these men come back not only alive but transformed, the victory is greater than any frontier. It becomes cultural, psychological, spiritual, And perhaps the most powerful lesson is right there. It was not weapons that ensured the legacy of American victory. They were the daily choices, standardized respect, confidence in routine. The faith that comfort, when shared, is more transformative than any speech, and that serving ice cream to the enemy is not surrender, it is moral supremacy. But there was still one last act in this story, a final gesture, apparently banal, but loaded with symbolism. Something that did not come from the government nor from the army, but from the prisoner himself. A gesture that silently sealed the surrender of totalitarian belief in the face of the discreet force of democracy. In the next part, we will find out what this gesture was and why it still echoes invisibly in the foundations of German reconstruction. In 1943, that prisoner from the beginning of history looked suspiciously at a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. He saw a strange symbol, perhaps a provocation, but what he didn't know yet, and what we now know clearly, is that it wasn't just a soft drink. That effervescent bottle was the visible tip of a colossal cog. Behind it, there was a network of mills, refrigerated trains, trucks, standardized farms, factories operating 24 hours a day, and an economic philosophy focused on a single objective: to make work, even in war, a system where comfort was not a luxury, but a method. The Reich fell because it believed that force was destruction. America won because it proved that strength was surrender. The war, which had begun with tanks and marches, ended quietly with food parcels crossing the Atlantic, sent by prisoners to their starving families. The collapse was not just military, it was ideological. The prisoners returned not with hatred, but with respect, not with vengeance, but with memory. And they took with them a new understanding. The enemy who fed them better than their own army could not be weak. It was invincibly functional. The universal lesson of this war is not only in the maps or in the trenches, but in the trays served without distinction, because in the end, what determines the course of a war is not isolated bravery, but the chain that feeds the system. Logistics wins morale because it sustains. Volume beats ideology because it repeats. A system capable of serving ice cream to the prisoner while supplying fronts on 5 continents isn't just winning, it's shaping the world. Logistics determines the strategy. And when this logistics is democratic, it doesn't just defeat armies, it reprograms consciences. We were defeated by trucks, admitted Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments. But the truth was even more bitter. There were trucks full of sugar, chocolate, books, milk, and dignity. If you believe that history is made in the details, leave the like and subscribe to strengthen this journey of research and historical truth. Comment below, what was the most shocking data for you in this video? And ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact, because the past still has a lot to reveal. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.